of Europe, shaping the European Union and making sure it delivers on the issues that matter to us. That is what this treaty offers. That is what the government offers, and I commend it to the House.
Order. The question is the bill be now read a second time. Mr. William Hague.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is all too typical of the government's management of our affairs that the House of Commons has been left with less than 5 hours to debate a measure of far-reaching importance in which there is widespread public interest. And it is typical, too, that the reason for that is two statements, both of which derive from the unremitting incompetence of the government. And it is still more typical that the Prime Minister, having signed the treaty but not had the courage to turn up for the ceremony, wants to force this through Parliament but lacks the courage to vote for it himself. Now, I must compliment the Foreign Secretary on his speech, because we expected him to put the case for the treaty, but not to do so in such a hugely entertaining way. When the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Crewe, asked him about the legal force of preambles, he was not really able to give an effective reply. And when the Honourable Member for Birkenhead asked him about support for his view about the differences between the treaties from House of Commons committees, he was not able to think of one. And when he listed the NSPCC among the supporters of the treaty because of its child protection provisions, he omitted to say that the government opposed those provisions going into the treaty. They were opposed. Seems like an important omission, Mr. Deputy Speaker. They were opposed by the Right Honourable Member for Neath at the European Convention, on the grounds that it would extend the competences of the European Union, or perhaps this was just an early incompetence from the Right Honourable Member for Neath. But I have to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if this is to be the quality of the Foreign Secretary's argument, it is a good job he has the Committee of Bishops on his side, because there will be nothing left for it but for him to pray. And now, it is worth noting. Yes, of course I give way.
To the honourable gentleman, isn't it fundamentally misleading for the right honourable gentleman? For the right honourable gentleman and his party to tell the public in Britain that they would renegotiate when not one single other country and not one single European Commissioner has said that they would be prepared to enter such negotiations?
Madam Deputy Speaker, it is hugely encouraging that Labour members' minds are so increasingly concentrated on the advent of a Conservative government. And not surprising that they want to know some of these things further in advance. But these debates are about this treaty and the case for a referendum on this treaty. And that is the case that we will be putting in the course of these debates. And it is worth noting at the outset, Madam Deputy Speaker, that there is much on foreign policy in which government and opposition agree, even on European matters. The commitments that we have made, which the Foreign Secretary just mentioned in fairness, to work for a European Union concerned with the great challenges of global poverty and global competition and global warming, rather than with the aggrandisement of its own internal institutions, have been echoed to some extent by ministers. The Prime Minister calling for a focus at the Lisbon Summit on the challenges of jobs, prosperity, the environment and security, and we agree with that. But while the aspirations and the language may often seem similar, the trouble with this bill and with this treaty is that it flies in the face of that British aspiration to create an outward-looking rather than inward-looking Europe. In a Europe which needs greater flexibility, it moves more power to the centre. And in a Europe where nations need the freedom to compete, it will narrow down those freedoms. And in a Europe committed to democracy, it will take more decision-making away from democratic control. I'll give way in a moment. Astonishingly, this treaty will also weaken one of the greatest strengths of the European Union for the last half-century, its commitment to undistorted competition in the single market, an outcome that can only have resulted from the supine ineffectiveness of Britain's negotiators. And on top of all this, it is a treaty that creates for the first time sweeping provisions for its own amendment without recourse to further treaties, and it brings about fundamental change in the institutional structure of the European Union, changes which the government initially opposed, then were happy to define as constitutional in their implications, and now pretend are matters of little importance about which the people of this country need not be troubled. For the most serious objection to the passage of this bill, irrespective of its merits or lack of them, is that the government intend to take it through Parliament without any of the consultation of the people that was promised at the last election, brazenly abrogating the commitment made by every party in this House to hold a national referendum in this event. The case for a referendum rests in part on the constitutional significance of what is proposed. When the former Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Blackburn, was asked on the 6th of June 2005 what the constitutional aspects of the treaty were which merited submission to a referendum, he said they were the creation of a permanent President of the Council of Ministers and a European Foreign Minister. Both of those provisions remain in the treaty today, and he is the Lord Chancellor today. That was his opinion at that time. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Right Honourable Gentleman, therefore, regret opposing a referendum on Maastricht?
Well, I will tell the Honourable Lady the difference between then and now, which is that then...
You were in government.
Then... That was a difference, something of which Liberal Democrats can only dream. But, of course, for the purposes of this argument, the important difference now is that no political party in the 1992 election promised the people of this country a referendum on Maastricht. In this case, every political party promised the people a referendum. And it is, therefore, a matter of trust in politics and the honour of our politics that that referendum has been held. The Foreign Minister, I referred a moment ago to the European Foreign Minister, has been renamed the High Representative of the Union. But as the Foreign Affairs Committee explained in their report only yesterday, we conclude there is no material difference between the provisions on foreign policy in the Constitutional Treaty, which the government made subject to approval in a referendum, and those in the Lisbon Treaty on which a referendum is being denied. But more than that, yes, of course.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. And does he further remember that in the 2005 election, when some of us said we needed to debate this huge transfer of powers because it was so important, the party opposite said there was no need for that debate in the election because there would be a referendum later. That is why it's such a cheat.
And my right honourable friend makes a powerful point, because that referendum, the case for it, rests above all on the need for this House and this government to honour commitments solemnly given. How many times have each of us in this House toured schools and colleges saying to young people they should take an interest in politics, that their vote makes a difference, that what is said at election time really counts? And what are we to say to them in the future? That the fact they elected an entire House of Commons committed to a referendum was of no account, that the government of the day regarded that commitment as a technicality to be escaped from rather than a promise to be kept, that the promises made at election time don't really matter at all. Today in our country the word of government is less readily believed than at any time. I'll give way, of course, in a few moments to the right honourable gentleman. Less readily believed than at any time in our modern history. Ministers, instead of tackling the apathy and cynicism that brings, will only add to it with the weasel words with which they try to escape their referendum commitment. And talking of escaping a referendum commitment, I did come across in The Guardian of October 2003 an article that held the headline, "We need an EU referendum. Nothing will damage the pro-European movement more than appearing to have something to hide." And it's by a certain N. Clegg, who went on to be the Right Honourable Member for Sheffield Hallam and is now leader of the Liberal Democrat. The real reason... Well, we know he's not on the plane with the Prime Minister, but for all the difference he makes to this debate, he might as well be. The real reason, of course, he says, why the government does not want to hold a referendum is the fear that it may lose. He had the analysis right then. It's a pity they won't stand by that analysis today. And I see we have flushed a Liberal Democrat to his feet.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. In 18 years in government, the Conservatives never once had a referendum on Europe. There was only the last time there was a referendum. Last time there was a referendum on the European Union, I was at primary school. Some members in this House weren't even born. Whereas the leader of the Liberal Democrats at the moment favours a referendum on whether we are in Europe or not in Europe. Why doesn't the Conservative Party back that promise?
Well, that apparently is the Liberal Democrat position, which apparently they tried to put down in a reasoned amendment for tonight's debate. And it has turned out that it is so crashingly irrelevant to the issue that it turned out not to be in order, which means they have the distinction of adopting as their policy a policy so irrelevant to the debate that they will at no stage even have the opportunity to vote for it. And even those at primary school could have worked that one out. Oh, I see a Liberal Democrat flagship has put to sea.
I'm grateful for the right honourable gentleman giving way. There was a vote on that question in amendment to the Queen's speech, and the Conservative Party, including himself, voted against that opportunity to give a referendum to the British people on Britain's membership of the European Union. Does he want to change his position now?
Keep the house! Well, the fact that the Conservative Party voted in line with its policy can hardly be an astonishing event at the end of the Queen's speech. What was noticeable was that very few members in other parties voted with the Liberal Democrats on that matter. But moving back to the case against the bill, in his speech, I promised to give way to the right honourable member, so I must do that first.
When the right honourable gentleman refers to promises made in general elections, does he remember that he led his party into the 2001 election on the slogan X days to save the pound? And is it not a fact? And is it not And is it not a fact that the pound remains safe today? I repeat, is it not a fact that the pound remains safe today because he and his ERM colleagues didn't get the chance to save it?
Right, well, yes, I'm sure we'll work that question out in the end. But I seem to remember that, yes, while the last Conservative government did enter the ERM, I also seem to remember that the Labour opposition and shadow cabinet of which he was a member was solidly in favour of doing so. So he mustn't be too abusive about the ERM. Let me give way to the right honourable member for Birkenhead.
I wonder whether the House might be able to help the Liberals in nailing their colours to the fence again. by actually saying it's a rather good idea, and that my voters would be well able to take a referendum with two questions on. One is, do they want to leave the European Union, which I guess overwhelmingly they would say no. Secondly, do they want this treaty or constitution? My guess is they would say no to.
Well, it will be hugely cheering to the Liberal Democrat Party that somebody somewhere does agree with part of their approach. But I don't think that will be sufficient for that policy to be able to be pursued in the proceedings on this treaty. Certainly, it is our position, as I think it is his position, that we want to be in the European Union, but we do not want to be taken over by the institutions of the European Union. And let me give way. I must make some progress in a moment, but of course I'll give way to the right honourable member from Sheffield.
Very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for a very entertaining speech, but the question that surely any aspirant opposition party for government must answer is, given the change that took place following the defeat of the Constitution by the French and Dutch voters, and the return to the table which led to the protocols and opt-outs negotiated by this government, what is it that the right honourable gentleman would believe he could achieve by the defeat of this treaty in a referendum and the consequent turning to the other 26 European governments and asking them for something that he's not identified he's prepared to go for?
Well, the right honourable member really gives me the cue to carry on with my analysis of the treaty and the bill, because I do want to look at this question of what was changed after the defeat in the French and Dutch referendum. The people of France and Holland, by the way, on that occasion, were given their opportunity to say no if they wished to do so. The people of Britain should have been given their opportunity to say yes or no. But let's turn to that very point, because in his speech, the Foreign Secretary allowed himself to parrot the only defence available to the government on this issue, that the constitutional concept has been abandoned, that there is a fundamental change, or he regularly comes up with that defence, but omitting to mention that in paragraph 1, paragraph 4, paragraph 18 of the mandate for the treaty, it sets out how almost the entire contents of the draft constitution are to be brought about by changes to the existing. No, I think I must proceed in fairness to the rest of the House, just for a little while. It is surprising that ministers continue to repeat this line when the European Scrutiny Committee told them in their report that we do not consider that references to abandoning a constitutional concept are helpful and consider they are even likely to be misleading, insofar as they might suggest the Reform Treaty is of lesser significance than the Constitutional Treaty. As Giscard d'Estaing, already quoted in our debate, put it in June, public opinion will be led to adopt without knowing it the proposals that we dare not present to them directly. All the earlier proposals will be in the new text but will be hidden and disguised in some way. And perhaps the most disarmingly honest description of what happened came that month from the Belgian Foreign Minister, who said the aim of the Constitutional Treaty was to be more readable. The aim of this treaty is to be unreadable. He said the Constitution aimed to be clear, whereas this treaty had to be unclear. It is a success. So, dishonest as the process has been, other European governments have at least been honest about the outcome. Not so the government of the United Kingdom, who have persisted in the argument that this is fundamentally different from the Constitution. How could we assess, Madam Speaker, how could an impartial observer even assess whether they are fundamentally different or whether they are substantially the same? Well, the obvious way is to read the articles of the Reform Treaty and compare them to those of the Constitution, a process undertaken both by the European Scrutiny Committee and by the pressure group Open Europe. And both studies have demonstrated that the vast majority of the provisions of the Constitution are replicated, often word for word, in the Reform Treaty. On one count, 240 of the 250 provisions of the Constitution being repeated and restored. In truth, all along, the government have been unwilling to be frank with Parliament about either this process or this outcome. Ministers maintained until the middle of June that nothing you could really call negotiations have taken place, even though we now know the negotiating Sherpas met on 24th of January, 2nd of May and 15th of May. Perhaps the Foreign Office officials who went along were just there as tourists, although for all the effect they had on the outcome, they might just as well have been. The criticism levelled at the government's handling of Parliament has been exceptional. The Foreign Affairs Committee... Let me conclude just this point. The Foreign Affairs Committee found that the 2007 Intergovernmental Conference mandate was agreed with little scope for UK public or parliamentary debate and engagement. It sets an unfortunate precedent damaging to the credibility of the institutional reform process itself. The European Scrutiny Committee, and these are committees with a Labour majority, reported that the process could not have been better designed to marginalise the role of national parliaments and to curtail public debate. So the story of the government in the evolution of this treaty has been one of dissembling and deceit, setting out deliberately to break a firm election promise, denying Parliament and public information about negotiations that were taking place, and then refusing to publish information that would help Parliament come to an informed decision. I give way to my honourable friend.
Would my right honourable friend be interested to know, as I understand it, that the legal advisor to the Foreign Office, who gave evidence to the European Scrutiny Committee only last month, has apparently now been appointed as the legal advisor to the European Scrutiny Committee in the House of Lords?
Well, I think this just shows, Madam Speaker, that the government have a case to answer. The implications of what he says will be far-reaching. This process of sustained deception leaves us with a treaty with three principal failings. The first is that it is not necessary. A recent study by the London School of Economics concluded that the business-as-usual picture of the EU is more convincing than the gridlock picture. The French Europe minister recently admitted, he said, that the thing that has most struck me since I took up this job 7 months ago is precisely the capacity of an EU of 27 members, and more one day, to take decisions. The fact is that the expansion of the EU to 27 members seems to have resulted in a greater readiness to reach consensus and a decline in the use of the veto. The wholly welcome agreement on climate change in the spring of last year being an outstanding example. That the European Union can achieve a great deal by working together on such issues and by pushing forward a free and genuine single market is not in doubt. And that makes it all the more extraordinary that one of the first aspects of this treaty that was agreed last June was that long-standing commitment of the European Union to undistorted competition, that would be downgraded. This was secured by the French government, with British ministers apparently asleep at the wheel, although a protocol was hastily added to the treaty, reaffirming the objective of free competition. European lawyers have been in no doubt about the implications, saying the excision of the competition principle from the front of the treaty is likely to have a number of damaging consequences for EC competition law. And as far as we know, no effort has been made by the government to restore undistorted competition to its rightful position in the objectives of the Union. It's a sad hallmark of this treaty that its provisions result from British ministers having things done to them rather than driven by them. The Foreign Secretary has said that the Conservative Party is almost alone, apart from the Dutch Animals Party, he said, in its opposition to the treaty. But we are not. For vast tracts of its provisions have for many years been opposed by the government itself. As recently as June, the government was fighting desperately to stop the EU High Representative taking the chair of the meetings of EU foreign ministers. But it's in the treaty. When it was first proposed that EU member states on the UN Security Council should be obliged to ask the High Representative to speak for the whole of the EU when there's a common position, the Right Honourable Member for Neath, again, representing the government, asked for the entire provision to be struck out. It's in the treaty. Ministers argued against the creation of an EU diplomatic service, but now it's there. They argued against the self-amending nature of the treaty, but then gave in. They opposed the election of the Commission President by the European Parliament, but then capitulated. They tried to prevent employment, public health, consumer protection and transport networks becoming shared competences with the EU, but failed. They said they were firmly opposed to establishing a European public prosecutor. Now it is in the treaty. They insisted that the EU not be given an explicit legal personality, which it is now to be given. They said that qualified majority voting on proposals made by the European Foreign Minister was simply unacceptable. Let me complete the list, but it's now there. They objected to the article on the Common Union Defence Policy, but then agreed to it. They opposed the EU having the power to set minimum criminal penalties, but then gave in. They said they would not accept ECJ jurisdiction over the third pillar areas of justice and home affairs, but capitulated on that as well. And this is not even an exhaustive list. The motto of the government as this treaty has been created has been anything for a quiet life and never mind the national interest. Yeah. Let me give way to the honourable member.
Because of the nature of interventions, I can pick just one, but take the single legal identity. Why is he so opposed to it? It's not a badge of statehood. Even the Universal Postal Union has a single legal identity, and the European Union already has one. So what's the complaint about?
For the same reasons that the former Prime Minister, Mr Tony Blair, stood at that dispatch box and told the House of Commons that at his insistence a legal personality for the European Union had been removed from earlier treaty negotiations. He felt so strongly about it, but the government eventually went with the flow of the argument in Europe rather than stick up for what had been their view. And now, let me move on a little, Madam Deputy Speaker, given the passage of time. Let that bring me to our next principal objection to the treaty, that it damages the British national interest and weakens democracy by setting up a process of continuing integration beyond the control of the electorate. When ministers, let me proceed for the moment. When ministers say they are happy to sign this treaty, but are opposed to any further political integration after that, They are merely continuing the habit of deception I detailed earlier, because the whole point of this treaty is to create a process of further integration, not to put a stop to it. As the Italian Prime Minister Romano Prodi has put it, as long as we have more or less a European Prime Minister and a European Foreign Minister, then we can give them almost any title. That is how many other countries see this treaty, but it's not how it is described by the government. The creation of a permanent president of the European Council, elected for 2.5 years at a time by majority voting, is a major constitutional innovation in the European Union and is intended to be such. We are all conscious in this Parliament, or we should be, of how the job of First Lord of the Treasury evolved in Britain, steadily developing a grip over other cabinet departments previously independent of it, and developing into the post of Prime Minister. The creation of that job took many years, and the Prime Minister probably feels that it took almost as long to get round to his turn to hold it. But to see how the post of a permanent President of the European Council could also evolve is not difficult even for the humblest student of politics, and it is, of course, rumoured that one Tony Blair may now be interested in the job. Now, if that makes us uncomfortable on these benches, just imagine how it is viewed in Downing Street. And I must warn ministers opposite that having tangled with Tony Blair across this dispatch box on literally hundreds of occasions, I know his mind almost as well as they do. I can tell them that when he goes off to a major political conference of a centre-right party and simultaneously refers to himself as a socialist, he is on manoeuvres. And he is busily building coalitions as only he can. And we can all picture the scene at a European Council sometime next year. Picture the face of our poor Prime Minister as the name of Blair is placed in nomination by one President and Prime Minister after another. The look of utter gloom on his face. The nauseating, glutinous praise oozing from every head of government. The rapid revelation of a majority view agreed behind closed doors when he was, as usual, excluded. Never would he regret more no longer being in possession of a veto. The famous drop jaw almost hitting the table as he realises there is no option but to join in. And then the awful moment when the motorcade of the President of Europe sweeps into Downing Street. The gritted teeth and bitten nails, the Prime Minister emerging from his door with a smile of intolerable anguish, the choking sensation as the words Mr. President are forced from his mouth. And then once in the cabinet room, the melodrama of when will you hand over to me all over again. There is, of course, a serious point here, Madam Deputy Speaker, occupied by someone with the political skill of our former Prime Minister. This job would become, in not so many years, a far more substantial one than the government now pretend, seen as the President of Europe by the rest of the world, with the role of national government steadily reduced and the role of national democracy and accountability steadily weakened. The naivety of ministers who think that by signing this treaty they are agreeing to a static constitutional position would be alarming were it not apparent in people with such senior responsibilities. Ah, but they say, look at the enhanced role of national parliaments which is set out in the treaty. If a majority in half the parliaments in the EU object to an EU measure, they might be able to block it. But once again, it doesn't take much of a political analyst to work out that the chances of this mechanism being employed on an irregular basis are vanishingly small. It could only be used if 14 different national parliaments, or nearly all of which have a government majority, defeated an EU proposal and did so in an 8-week period. Yet we only have to consider this for a moment as members of Parliament to begin to laugh about it. With the difficulties of oppositions winning a vote in their parliaments, the odds against doing so in 14 countries on the same issue, with the variety of parliamentary recesses around Europe lasting up to 10 weeks in our own case, means that even if the European Commission were to propose the slaughter of the firstborn, it would be very difficult to achieve such a remarkable conjunction of parliamentary votes. The last defence of ministers on this treaty is that they have achieved their red lines. Yet, as the chairman of the European Scrutiny Committee has judged, the red lines leak like a sieve. They will be much debated over the coming weeks. But the central fact to remember about the red lines is that the government claimed to have achieved exactly the same red lines when they signed the European Constitution and proposed a referendum. And that brings me back, Madam Deputy Speaker, to our strongest objection of all, to the bill before this House. The government's contention that this treaty is so different from the European Constitution that they are relieved of their promise to hold a referendum is shared by few independent observers, and not even by those members of their own party who have given the most time and commitment to this process. The Honourable Member for Edgbaston, I hope I won't embarrass her by quoting her, explained to the Prime Minister, "Sticking to your guns in defence of a patently dishonest position is not leadership, but the soft option and a cop-out from a specific promise made to voters." And whatever the niceties of the argument, by no stretch of the imagination is the treaty so different from the Constitution as to relieve them of their promise. Every survey on the matter has shown the vast majority of our country would like to have their say. The government is banking, in the words of the Belgian Foreign Minister, on the treaty being too unreadable for people to worry about. But its constitutional innovations are sufficiently sweeping, and its erosion of our national democracy sufficiently serious, that many of us will have no hesitation not only in voting against it, but in voting for a referendum at every opportunity. Because all of us must remember, no, I won't give way anymore, I'm coming to the end of my speech. All of us must remember that we have no democratic mandate from the voters to agree to this treaty without their approval. None of us in this House told voters we would agree to a treaty nearly identical to the Constitution and ram it through without their being allowed to have their say on it, either in an election or a referendum. If this House voted for such a referendum, it would be a magnificent assertion of honour in politics and trust in the nation. If it fails to do so, and if it passes this bill without one, it will have connived in the actions of a deceitful and cowardly government whose actions will have further stained the name and reputation of our politics.
Order. Could I remind all honourable and right honourable members that Mr. Speaker has imposed an 8-minute limit on all backbench speeches. Mr.